Aurelian is on a mission to reunify Rome, and so he we covered his efforts east against Zenobia. So Zenobia is the um, wife of Odaenathus, who was killed, and so she essentially takes the reins on the Eastern Empire, and so her and Aurelian are battling it out, and she, in an attempt to gain support because Aurelian overtook her army, she leaves the capital of Turkey to go persuade the Sassanid king to assist in her efforts. And so she's already lost Egypt. So Aurelian was able to bring back Egypt to the fold and has also brought back the western region of Rome to the fold. So Aurelian gains word, or gets word that Zenobia has left the capital. So he sends out cavalry and ends up taking her prisoner. And so he essentially puts a quash to her efforts and is able to start bringing back the Eastern Empire into the fold as well. So now he's focusing on the economy of Rome. So he builds a number of mints around the Roman Empire in an attempt to minimize any corruption that may rise within the monetary system. So by building more mints, if one does end up being corrupted, the influence or the effects of that are a little or minimal compared to having three mints around the empire. So that's one of his efforts right now, and then he, if you remember, he had a dream where a Greek philosopher, which at the time is thought of in comparison to Jesus. So they equate this Greek philosopher. I'm not going to reattempt his name because, well, probably I'll forget in an hour anyway. So he's thought of as a miracle worker, and he died and joined the gods. So Aurelian believes that he visited him in a dream and, um, you know, told Aurelian that in order to be a great ruler, that he should practice mercy and wisdom. So, time and again, Aurelian had the opportunity. If you remember, Aurelian's nickname was hand on hilt. So he was kind of an enforcer, very very strict, but he practiced restraint and showed mercy often. And so, when he took Zenobia prisoner, the armies wanted her, basically beheaded, and he refused, kept her prisoner. And he also started being influenced by some of the philosophy at the time and became essentially a monotheist. So he um, believed that started believing that there was only one God who was soul. Um, they're the sun god, and so he established the Sol Invictus, I think is where we ended. So he um, established the day Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, which is the birthday of the invincible sun, on December 25th. And Aurelian had practiced a good amount of wisdom. Even though he was a monotheist, he still allowed the more popular pagan polytheism to exist within Roman citizens. because he knew that if he tried to institute a policy of monotheism, that he would be facing probably a lot of uprising on the brink of just now bringing Rome back to almost a unified empire. He also, so in 275, Shapur had died, who was the king that had captured Valerian, one of the previous emperors, who went against Shapur in Shapur's kind of advancement west, and so Valerian was captured, and there's some debates on how he was, if he remained a prisoner through his life, or if he was killed and paraded around the Persian Empire. So Aurelian, upon Shapur's death, Aurelian takes up vengeance against the Sassanids for Valerian's capture. So he starts marching east to start confronting the Sassanid Empire, but he never makes it. So he was killed by a couple of misguided assassins who, after they assassinated him, immediately regretted it, because they were hired by one of Aurelian's secretaries. So Aurelian had the secretary who had lied about something, and so for that, he thought that Aurelian would have had him killed. So in order to save his skin, the secretary hired a couple of assassins to kill Aurelian. So almost immediately after the officers found out that this was really just a trick by the secretary was tortured to death. So even though one of Aurelian's goals was to establish the sole worship of the sun god Sol, he, as I mentioned, he allowed Roman citizens to continue worshiping multiple pagan gods. And as far as the Christian movement, he initially allowed the same freedom. So during the first periods of Aurelian's rule, the Christians had almost, very little persecution. They were allowed to freely worship, because he recognized the edict of Gallienus, who, previously established an edict would allow freedom to worship. But in 275, he rescinded this edict, and we don't know why, but he commenced to systematic persecution of Christians. So this was really a heavy blow to the and other Eastern churches who enjoyed religious freedom while under Zenobia. So if you remember, Zenobia was partly Arab, so she allowed a lot of the Christian movement found refuge in the East and under her rule. So upon her defeat, Aurelian instituted persecutions, and so a lot of the major churches, especially in Antioch, fell under persecution. So after Aurelian's assassination, this left Rome with the issue of succession. But this time, instead of the army or the Senate rushing to choose a replacement, they forced the decision onto one another to make them pick an emperor who could continue Aurelian's vision of unifying Rome. So the officers would pass the decision on to the Senate, because otherwise, for them to pick a successor, it would have been evidence to the army being involved in the assassination of Aurelian. So they said, we don't want the responsibility of picking the emperor. We'll give that to the Senate. And then on the other hand, the Senate refused to name one of their own in fear of the army as well, because whenever the Senate named an emperor, one of their own as emperor, he didn't last very long and would be killed by the army. So either party refused to name an emperor. So it was estimated that Rome was essentially emperorless for 6 months. But in the meantime, the Senate would take over day-to-day responsibilities of the empire. So eventually, the Senate elected, much to their chagrin, Tacitus. So they assigned Tacitus to the purple, and just like the Senate had the reason why they didn't want to name an emperor because they didn't last long, Tacitus didn't last very long. So history has very little information on Tacitus, but what we do know is that he immediately set out to deal with conspirators of Aurelian's murder and had them all killed. And then, upon hearing of Aurelian's death, the Germans also once again started advancing south. And so Tacitus spent basically the rest 6 months of his life dealing with the Germans. So, so on his way, as he's dealing with the Germans, the Franks also start making an advancement on Rome from the west. And so Tacitus starts heading out west to deal with the Franks, but history doesn't know really how he died, whether he succumbed to an illness or was assassinated, but he died on his trip to deal with the Franks. So he ruled for 6 months. Mm-mm. Tacitus? No, he was a senator. I think that was like 100 years before this. Yeah. I can go back and look up his name, but I'll, for the sake of time, yeah. So taking his place was an Aurelian general serving as commander-in-chief of the eastern province, and that was Probus. So during Probus's military career, he was placed in charge of reintegrating the eastern provinces back into Rome. And so Aurelian essentially set him in charge of reintegrating Zenobia's territory. So Probus, upon taking the purple, Probus immediately marched west back to Rome to officially take up the purple and to confront Tacitus's brother Florian, who, upon Tacitus' death, Florian believed he had legitimacy to the throne. So Florian, who was made Praetorian prefect by Tacitus, took some of his best men and marched east to confront Probus. But what Florian didn't take into account were the bonds that under Aurelian, Probus had basically, built a really good relationship with the Eastern soldiers, Eastern legions. So they were a, very tight-knit, well-coordinated set of legions. So when Florian went out to meet him, the men that he chose, basically realized that they were marching to, certain death. So they decided to side with Probus, and so they assassinated Florian on their way to confront Probus. So Probus spent his initial years as emperor dealing with the Franks and the Alemanni. So if you remember, the Alemanni are a Germanic tribe that had, been a pain in Rome's side for several decades. So they had at one point made it all the way to Rome. So he's dealing with the Franks, the Alemanni. In the sporadic defeats, the Franks and the Alemanni would be allowed to settle with Rome with established peace. So Probus kind of carries the policy that Aurelian had. If you remember, as when Aurelian would defeat some of the Germanic tribes, he would both integrate their families into Rome, and then he would enlist their fighting men into his military. Probus was also effective in dealing with the Vandals along the Danube with the battle-hardened and almost unbeatable army that he had established. Probus then started something new within the Roman Empire. He had his soldiers begin working on land restoration and public works. So, basically what this meant is that after 50 years of constant wars, Rome now was enjoying relative peace. So the Sassanids during this time were no longer a threat after Shapur's death, because the Sassanids were dealing with internal strife, who was going to take the throne. The Goths had been beaten down to a point of submission that would last for a century, and the strength of the Franks and the Alemanni was being siphoned into supporting Rome. So Probus began announcing peace, and that eventually Rome would no longer need an army. So as you can imagine, this didn't go over well with the army, and they thought they'd be no different than civilians, and spending out the rest of their careers digging ditches and building walls. So a lot of them began rising up in revolt. And so Probus went out to meet one of the primary revolting legions, but he was overtaken and assassinated. So he was 50 years old and ruled for just over 6 years. Little is known about Probus' handling of the Christian movement, but it is known that the movement enjoyed relative peace and essentially the calm before the storm that would be Diocletian at this point. So Probus's Praetorian prefect is proclaimed emperor. So that's Carus. So following the assassination, and he was a Galatian, born in Gaul. Carus immediately had the soldiers that killed Probus executed and elevated his two sons, Caranus and Numerian, as co-emperors. So Carus sent Caranus to Rome to represent the interests of the emperor and to rule over the Western Empire, while Carus and Numerian focused on the east. So Carus and Numerian headed east to launch an attack on the Sassanid Empire, while the Sassanids were focused on advancing the empire east through present-day Afghanistan. So, once the Sassanids had agreed on a ruler, they changed their direction and started marching east to further their empire. So Carus took this opportunity to advance into their empire and take their territory. So he was able to advance. Carus was able to advance his army across the Tigris without facing significant opposition. And on their advancement, Carus suddenly fell over dead. The Romans at the time believed that he was struck by lightning as a sign that he had swayed from Rome's path by advancing too far east. So Numerian decided to retreat west to Syria, and eventually on his way west to meet up with his brother Caranus. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I mean they were still producing coins. It was just the content of silver in them was very minimal.
So the two bottom guys were brothers.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Numerian decides to retreat west. Eventually, on his way west to meet his brother Carinus, the soldiers begin to realize something was amiss when Numerian refused to leave his tent for days, while Numerian's father-in-law, who was the Praetorian prefect at the time, issued orders on his behalf. So Numerian's kind of holed up in his tent, and so his father-in-law is kind of, issuing commands. And so the Praetorian prefect found his father-in-law found himself gaining power after the death of Numerian's father, Carus. And so, becoming suspicious of Numerian's father-in-law and being confirmed by a growing stench coming from Numerian's tent, the army could no longer ignore their suspicions, and so they entered his tent and found the rotting corpse of Numerian. So his father-in-law had been issuing orders in the name of a dead man. So the army had to approach the replacement carefully as to not rise opposition against Carinus, who is back in the west. And so they decided on a man named Diocles, who would become known as Diocletian. So he was really a no-name general, but he was brilliant at backroom politics, and he inspired personal loyalty. Just his demeanor and the way that he talked to his soldiers really inspired them to follow him. And this would, follow this skill set of his would lead for him to, become one of the more prominent emperors in this period of Rome. So, enter Diocletian. So Diocletian immediately made it known that he would not be entering Rome anytime soon, that he had no interest in symbolic power of the Senate. So his idea was to remove Rome from the political equation. So Diocletian also decided right away that the job of emperor was too big for just one man due to both external and internal threats, for fear of both raids from other nations and internal revolts and assassinations. The emperors always had to travel with their army, which was really the largest army in the empire. So they did this, partly in case, one of the ambitious generals would, get the idea to revolt. So, as the emperor traveled around, he would have an army that would be large enough to confront the revolt. So this meant that any major threat or external invasion had to be met with the emperor and his army leaving a lot of the borderland open. So Diocletian decided on co-emperors, which up until this point was only done out of dynastic concern. So it was always, someone that was related to the emperor that would be established as co-emperor, whether it was by blood or by adoption. So this is the first time in Rome where the emperor sets up a co-emperor that has no relation to him. So the co-emperors that Diocletian established would rule over different regions of the empire, allowing them to respond quicker to threats, and would also half the administrative work that one person doing, making the bureaucracy far more efficient. So Diocletian decided on someone outside his family whose loyalty he could count on, and so he names, just as a side note, so Diocletian, in his effort to remove any political power from Rome, sets up his capital in Nicomedia, which is in Turkey. So he assigns Maximian as co-emperor. So Maximian was 5 years younger than Diocletian, but he was just close enough in age that they would rise through the ranks of military together, but they were far apart, enough apart in age that Diocletian would always be his superior. Maximian was a great general and a competent administrator, but he had no political talents and was completely uninterested in politics, giving Diocletian assurance that Maximian had no aspirations to become a rival. So Maximian was tasked with overseeing the West and Gaul, while Diocletian would head out to oversee the East. And so one of Diocletian's primary missions was to deal with the fallout of Carus's previous invasion of Persia. So he knew that, once Persia had a chance to recuperate, they would respond in kind and invade West. So he was proactive in trying to prevent that. So as I mentioned, Diocletian set up the capital city in Nicomedia in Turkey, and a year later received an invitation of peace from the now Sassanid king Bahram II. So the two entered into an agreement and established a border between the two kingdoms, between the Sassanid and Roman kingdom. So they now have peace with the Sassanid Empire. Excuse me. Maximian, on the other hand, didn't have it as easy. So after establishing Milan, Italy as his capital, which is north, I think Milan's right here. So he establishes that as the capital. Rome had a famous general named Carausius, who broke away from Rome and proclaimed himself Augustus, which he also proclaimed himself Emperor of Britannia and Northern Gaul. So Maximian was busy dealing with the Alemanni at the time, and so he sent Carausius in charge of dealing with the growing threat of the Frankish pirates. So, here he sends his great naval general to deal with these Frankish pirates. And at first, Maximian was doing good by pushing back the Germans, while Carausius was easily overtaking the Franks. But Maximian started receiving reports that Carausius was keeping the loot that they would take from the pirates for himself and his troops instead of sending it back to the treasury. And so Carausius would even wait for the pirates to finish looting, these Roman port towns before he would go and take over the pirates in order to gain more loot. So Maximian viewed this as completely dishonorable, and so he demanded that Carausius return and answer for his acts, but the naval general, in fear of what would happen, refused the demand, and so Maximian had him named enemy of the state and ordered his execution. So this is when Carausius named himself Emperor of Britannia and Northern Gaul. So, he's named enemy of the state, but Carausius has basically the entire Roman navy at his disposal. And on top of that, he's got an extensive amount of loot. Yeah, basically. So Carausius took his navy along with his loot to Britain, and using the loot, secured the service of the legions stationed there. It also became known that Carausius was having back-channel talks with the Franks, and once he broke away from Rome, he gained the support of the Franks along Gaul's coast, as well as many of the Germanic tribes, because he was in active revolt against Rome. So Maximian, on the other hand, had no fleet and no experience crossing the English Channel, and was dealing with the Alemanni and more Franks at the same time. So, for the time being, he allowed Carausius to basically keep his self-proclaimed title as Emperor of Britain and to have his little kingdom. So Maximian spent the next couple of years building up a navy and going, essentially scorched earth on the Germanic tribes to remove any support that Carausius would gain from the mainland. And then in 288, Diocletian decided two things in fear that the office of emperor would lose its legitimacy. So the first was to take a page out of Marcus Aurelius's, aka Commodus, aka Jacqueline Phoenix, out of his playbook. If you remember, over the years, the elevated position of emperor had lost its potency, and emperors could be knocked off at any moment given the majority power of the soldiers. So in order to reinstall the legitimacy of the emperor and take the power away from the soldiers, rather than looking down to the legions or over to the Senate for legitimacy, the emperor should look up to the heavens. So this was a hugely important step in the history of political theory in the West, in Western Europe, because it was here that Diocletian laid the foundation for 1,500 years of divinely appointed kings. So that was one of his first initiatives. The second was he would head west to aid his brother emperor in fear that Carausius' bold acts would begin inspiring other ambitious generals and their troops. So Diocletian began telling everyone that he was appointed by Jupiter and Maximian was appointed by Hercules, and that they were the god agents put on earth. Diocletian took on the nickname Jovius, as he represented Jupiter, and Maximian took on the nickname Herculeus. Diocletian would be Jupiter, the person to establish policy, and Maximian Hercules, the person to carry out those policies. Both Diocletian and Maximian spent the next year obliterating the Germans and pushing back up across the Rhine, removing all Germanic support from Carausius. So satisfied, Diocletian headed back to the east and left Maximian to deal with Carausius. And in 289, Maximian made an attempt for Britain, but found out quickly how inexperienced his soldiers were at playing navy and how experienced Carausius' soldiers were at, being sailors. So Carausius had also spent a couple years fortifying the Britain coast, including the forts of the Saxon shores. So even if Maximian did overtake Carausius, it would have been almost an on the Britain. So Maximian once again failed to overtake Carausius, and his naval fleet was utterly destroyed. So news reached Diocletian, and in 290 he began his trek west again. Along the way, he began formulating plans for a new world order. So Maximian, having suffered such a heavy loss, began suspecting some of his generals were becoming weary of his command. And so in an attempt to keep them loyal, he married off his daughter to one popular and Praetorian prefect and governor, Constantius. So Constantius, who then divorced his wife Helena and married Maximian's daughter Theodora. So Constantius would father a son with his first wife Helena, who would become Constantine. So upon reaching Milan, Diocletian threw festivals and games along with Maximian to show that even though Maximian suffered twice the defeat from Carausius, that they were still unified, and that the relationship between the two emperors was still strong as ever. In the background, Diocletian spent his time discussing his plans with Maximian for this new world order, and then he headed back east. So after reaching his capital in Nicomedia in early 293, Diocletian made his new world order official and established what we now call the Tetrarchy, which is rule of 4. So he named Constantius and Galerius co-emperors. So they weren't named they were named Caesar but not Augustus. So they had the office of emperor, but they were still under Diocletian and Maximian's authority. So I'm 5 minutes over. I'll end there. We'll be spending a lot of time on Diocletian because there's a lot of things that go on with within the Christian movement and within Rome that are highly influential. So we'll probably be spending a couple weeks at this period in history. All right. Any comments or questions? Like he's what? Oh.
He looks like he has that
He looks like one of those shaman from. Yeah. He looks like he would sound like one of those dudes from Minecraft.
Maximus looks like he has like some kind of thyroid disorder. It's bugging out.
Yeah, all the statues of him have these huge eyes. Like